Dragon Palace is a new short story collection from famed Japanese author Hiromi Kawakami, translated into English by Ted Goossen. This is a collection of 8 short stories, and each one of them deals in some way with transformation. I have a wonderful personal history with Hiromi Kawakami. I've read everything she has written that's been translated into English, and fun fact, her book Strange Weather in Tokyo was the first Japanese novel in translation I ever read. I read that novel maybe 7 years ago now? 8 years ago? But I loved it. I was absolutely entranced. And I'm so glad that my first Japanese book wasn't by Haruki Murakami. I read that, then I read The Nakano Thrift Store. When The 10 Loves of Nishino came out, I read and reviewed that. Same for People from My Neighborhood, and honestly, People from My Neighborhood is my second favorite book of hers. If you haven't read it, it's a tiny little short story collection centered around one neighborhood, one kind of village. And it's the most Twin Peaks thing I've ever read. Hiromi Kawakami is wonderful. I absolutely adore her. I've read and reviewed multiple of her books, as I said, and I'm so glad that I got to read and review Dragon Palace. This collection is about 160 pages long, and it showcases, more than anything else, Kawakami's knack for blending folklore and surrealism into modern-day social politics and general life experience. When I first read Strange Weather in Tokyo, I read it as an allegory of old Japan meeting new Japan, the traditions and history of Japan trying to find a way to coexist with the capitalistic, giant cityscape office culture of modern Japan. And then each Kawakami book that I read after that became progressively more surreal, and I really admire her for that. The Nakano Thrift Store is probably the most grounded thing of hers I've read, and it's probably my least favorite. The more surreal she gets, the more she gets to experiment with her own imagination and creativity and ways of expression. And all of that is very, very true here with Dragon Palace. As I said, every story in here deals with transformation in some way. Quite often our protagonists are people who can transform, or have transformed at some point in their life, or they meet and they talk about and they teach us about people that they know who transform in some way. For example, the very first story in here is about a guy who left his career behind because he got burnt out and he moved back to his hometown by the sea. One day he's walking along the beach and he meets an old man who appears out of nowhere. And this old man says that he used to be an octopus. He claims to be really, really old, and he claims to have been living in his human form for like 200 years, and he still hasn't gotten used to it. And he convinces our protagonist to kind of go bar and restaurant hopping, eating more and more food and getting progressively more and more drunk around this small, quiet town. It becomes clear that people don't like this old man very much, and he's kind of a con man. The second story is the titular Dragon Palace. And this one is about a young woman in the modern day who is suddenly visited by a tiny little version of her great-grandmother. And from here we learn about this great-grandmother's life. The story flits back and forth between what's currently happening and what kind of life the great-grandmother lived. And it turned out that when she was a little girl, this great-grandmother started speaking in tongues and randomly quoting Buddha. It made her seem like some kind of a messiah, and people began flocking to her. She developed a kind of cult of followers. And when she was presumably in her late teens, early 20s, her followers started living with her. 2 of them taught her about sex. They are a married couple and they invite her into their marital bed. And from here, she realizes that she can use sex to control people. She has manipulative, transformative powers. Transformation here is less about transforming into a monster or an animal of some sort, but rather transforming the minds of people, transforming herself into a kind of deity. It's strange and fun, and definitely one of those wonderful stories where we get to see kind of the corrupting force of belief in certain situations, and also the realization from a young woman that she can use sex to control and manipulate people. It's a lot of fun. My favorite story in here is just called Mole, and it's set in a world where moles and humans coexist. Moles are described as large, humanoid, anthropomorphized things that live amongst people in this kind of strange future. Our protagonist is a mole, and at the beginning of the story we learn that he and his family take in humans who have considered or attempted suicide, people who have given up on their lives. And they take them in and nurture them and look after them in their underground home. But then we see that our protagonist, this father of a family of moles, goes off to work in an office building amongst humans, and the humans treat the moles like second-class citizens. They treat them like shit. This is a story that seems to be examining the hypocrisy of racism, class divide, and other social segregations that go on in modern society. The moles are good people, they treat the humans well, they don't judge them, they help the ones that need help, and they're not treated with kindness in return. The ways in which you're going to analyze these stories, the conclusions you're going to draw in terms of what metaphors and allegories are being explored here, they might be quite personal to you. You might not find anything. You might find that these are simply just fun stories about sex and love and beauty and transformation and change, maturation, or they're just forms of fun surrealism. I really think that's up to you. Hiromi Kawakami is malleable as a writer, and that's kind of funny given that these are stories about change and transformation, because she has shown herself to be a pretty chameleonic writer. She's able to write in a lot of different ways to a lot of different purposes and blend very grounded human stories with surrealism. And the fact that a lot of these stories seem to be inspired by Japanese folklore. I've already mentioned a story that references Buddhism and leans into Buddhism. There's another story about an old man who is possessed by a fox spirit, and that is leaning into Shintoism. Shintoism and Buddhism are the two main religions or ways of life in Japan. And she's drawing on that local folklore to create fresh, new, and exciting stories. It feels like these stories could have been written hundreds of years ago. Okay, I don't know if you can hear that, but someone is like cutting hedges outside. Sorry. I'm just gonna power through this, and hopefully it's not too annoying. These are stories that seem to revel in their own context. Stories that enjoy looking at transformation and what that means, and what it could offer us. It's also interesting to see how human the people in these stories are, given that these are stories about change and about magic and about impossible things happening. The people in these stories remain human. They remain relatable. No matter how surreal and strange the stories are, it's very easy to relate to the experiences and the emotions of these people. They come up against things that are difficult that we can understand. There's no lack of relatability here. Kawakami is kind of saying no matter who you are, what your experience is, whether you live for 1,000 years, whether you used to be a jellyfish, none of that matters. We're still human, and we can still empathize with each other and relate to each other, and that's just gorgeous. And I think that's best expressed in the final story in the collection, which is called Seahorse. And it tells the story of a woman who used to be a seahorse, and one day she washed up on land and decided to live her life as a human. She married a local fisherman, and she kind of moved from man to man. She was kind of pushed around a little bit. She would end up boring someone and moving on, either by her own choice or because she was kind of encouraged to. She would have kids or not have kids, and as the story goes on, she has a teenage daughter who has decided to live her life as a seahorse and wants to return to the sea. And her mother has to tackle that and come to terms with that and wonder, is that a good idea? Because she left the sea behind. She didn't want to go back. She has chosen to live her life as a human, but she has a daughter who wants to go to the sea for the first time, the place that her mother left behind. And this is something so relatable. People want what they want, and sometimes we can be really surprised by that. I'm from a small village in the countryside. I love living in a city. I've lived in Shanghai, Tokyo, London. I love big cities. And when I meet people who love living in the countryside or are looking forward to moving out to the countryside one day, it baffles me because I came from there. And it was boring. It's beautiful, but there's nothing to do. You can't get any sushi. You can't walk to a bookshop or a cafe. I don't get it. And so in that way, Seahorse was just the most simply relatable story for me. This is a really wonderful collection. Not every story will hit you in the same way, and some of them you might find weird and nonsensical, some that you might find you really relate to. It's very much going to be a person-to-person basis kind of a collection. Some stories will hit you in different ways. You might find that you don't get along with any of it. I really feel like that's down to you, the reader. All I can do is tell you that I enjoyed it, why I enjoyed it, and what I took away from it. Hopefully I've done that, and you can make up your own mind whether or not you're going to check this out. But Hiromi Kawakami is a legend of Japanese literature. Ted Goossen's translation is wonderful. I've never been let down by a single book of hers, and that continues to be true, as is evidenced by Dragon Palace. So check it out, and subscribe for books.